1934, December. Japan denounced the international naval treaties. This action tore the shackles off American naval design. It initiated an urgent and ambitious project. The goal was to create a new class of battleships. These ships had to mount the decisive 16-inch main battery gun. This shift culminated in the design of Battleship 1937. It was a powerful compromise, born entirely of necessity. Designers were constrained by the need to fit through the Panama Canal locks. This limited the ship's beam to 108 feet, 3 inches. It was also initially constrained by the 35,000-ton standard displacement limit. Despite these limits, the USS Washington emerged as a symbol of American resolve. Its final armament included 9 16-inch guns. These guns could launch 2,700-pound shells. They were capable of 13 inches of armor penetration. With 14,849 tons of armored steel, the ship signaled the entry of a formidable new asset into the fleet. The keel of the Washington was laid in Philadelphia in 1938. By May 15, 1941, the ship was commissioned. Captain Howard H. J. Benson took command. This commissioning marked the start of a complex assembly and training process. It was a technological leap that often overwhelmed new recruits. The massive vessel was packed with sophisticated new machinery and automatic fire controls. To apprentice seamen like Raymond Goff, it felt like a disorienting maze. The sheer scale of the fitting-out process was staggering. It involved enormous components, including 6-inch plow steel towing cables. New sailors like Sam Scalzo felt utterly overwhelmed by the size of the ship. In their pursuit of maximum efficiency, designers had worked to overly close tolerances. This set up misfits that simply did not work. These problems created immediate mechanical headaches. They compounded the challenge of training a green crew for the coming war. But the greatest challenge was a fundamental design flaw. It worked unseen beneath the waterline. The new twin-skegged hull design was intended to improve performance. Instead, it harbored a critical engineering disaster. This flaw was violently exposed during a full power run on May 31, 1947. It was a moment of terrifying, escalating chaos. It threatened the structural integrity of the entire new battle fleet. Could this technological marvel survive its own power? The super high-pressure boilers drove the 4 sets of geared turbines past 120,000 horsepower. The immense hull surged toward its maximum speed of 28 knots. Then, the ship began to tear itself apart. Severe vibrations were generated by the turbulence the propellers created against the novel skegs. The force reverberated violently from the ship's foundations. It traveled all the way up to the highest director. Men felt the debilitating force in their teeth and bones. Deck plates hammered under their feet. The noise was deafening. A sickening, grinding roar. It signified not propulsion, but self-destruction. Light bulbs broke throughout the compartments. Rangefinder mechanisms dislocated. The entire vessel seemed to shudder in violent protest. The vibration was a palpable, physical threat. It transformed the technological marvel into a terrifying, uncontrollable machine. The discovery necessitated immediate and costly repairs. This revealed the messy, trial-and-error reality of introducing cutting-edge technology under extreme pressure. The Washington returned to League Island for dry docking. Engineers undertook extensive reinforcement of the propulsion systems. They added external bracing to the after-main battery director. They modified and replaced propellers in a grueling effort to ease the pressure on the skegs. There was no time for seamless refinement, however. The geopolitical situation was escalating rapidly. The North Atlantic was already operating on a war footing. This reality was underscored by the torpedoing of the destroyer Reuben James. That attack occurred on October 31st. It was an evil portent of the conflict to come. The final log entry of peacetime was made on December 5th. 2 days later, on December 7, 1941, the news arrived. The USS Washington was at Lynn Haven Roads when they heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor. The initial reaction was one of disbelief and confusion. Officers in the clubhouse were in a terrible tizzy. They questioned the accuracy of the reports they were receiving. Operational capital ships were urgently needed. Yet, the Washington was initially assigned to totally unnecessary training in Key West. This was a source of intense frustration for a crew eager for action. By December 13th, the ship became the flagship of Rear Admiral John W. Wilcox. The Washington was thrust immediately into a critical operational role. The intensive testing and modifications had been born from the initial engineering crisis. These efforts ensured the battleship was more robust and capable. It was now stronger than the compromised design had initially suggested. The commissioning of the USS Washington marked the entry of a powerful American asset. Though technically challenging, it was vital for the U.S. Navy. The world had irrevocably changed. Despite their preparation, the crews were eager for the Pacific. They considered it the plum of the whole Pacific campaign. They had signed up specifically to avenge Pearl Harbor. But a strategic pivot was forced upon them. This pivot followed the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse. There was also a threat posed by Japanese ambitions toward Madagascar and the Indian Ocean. This forced the USS Washington and Task Force 39 toward the frigid North Atlantic. This deployment was driven by U.S. strategic considerations and British vulnerability. It was met with frustration by men who felt diverted from the real fight. Why were they steaming north instead of west? The assembly of Task Force 39 was characterized by vague, high-command decisions. There was a pervasive sense of improvisation. New recruits poured in, many immediately overwhelmed by the scale of their new home. Seaman Second Class Melvin Beckstrand was fresh off the Dakota prairies. He experienced instant seasickness during his 4-hour transfer journey. Yet he was awestruck by the mammoth creature of the battleship. He still found the living conditions too crowded. Officers expected to review recognition symbols of Japanese planes and ships. Instead, they were handed silhouettes of German U-boats and Dorniers. The task force officially departed Casco Bay, Maine on March 26, 1946, but the voyage was immediately shadowed by tragedy. The day after their departure, Rear Admiral Wilcox was lost overboard. He was the commander of Task Force 39. Amidst wild rumors and conflicting eyewitness accounts, the admiral vanished into the churning Atlantic. In a dramatic display of command, Captain Benson ordered the rescue launch back to safety. He acted to prevent further loss of life in the heavy seas. A memorial service was held for the Martinet admiral. His loss cast a grim pall over the critical mission that lay ahead. Upon arriving at Scapa Flow on April 2nd, the Americans were greeted by the formidable British home fleet. The integration of Task Force 39 immediately highlighted stark differences. These differences were in naval doctrine and capability. British battleships suffered from questionable design and less than excellent wartime maintenance. They were unflatteringly described as big oil eaters and short-legged. The USS Washington, by contrast, was immediately recognized as a superior asset. The Washington was a first-class gunnery platform. It bristled with 20 twin-mounted radar-controlled 5-inch batteries. Its anti-aircraft fire control was noted by the British as vastly superior. During initial combined training, the Washington demonstrated this dominance. It hit a target sleeve towed by an aircraft with devastating precision. British attempts, in comparison, had only produced flak that exploded right up at the sleeve. The operational environment of the North Atlantic was a relentless adversary. The task force endured heavy seas, fog, rain, and snow. Visibility was often reduced to a terrifying 1,500 yards. Storms raged for 10 solid days. Waves were described as snow-covered mountains. Solid walls of green water crashed over the decks. Constant fog and icebergs were always a menace. These dangers were compounded by the 24 hours of daylight in the northern latitudes. The perpetual light exposed the ships to penetrating air and U-boat attacks. The crew faced a thoroughly dirty North Atlantic dawn. They also faced the constant, chilling threat from the powerful German surface fleet. This fleet included the battleship Tirpitz, lurking in the Norwegian fjords. Despite the grim conditions, The mission was politically necessary. It involved supporting the vital Murmansk convoys. These convoys were the lifeline supplying the Soviet Union. This dangerous duty had already incurred unacceptable losses. This led Admiral Tovey to recommend halting the convoys entirely. Yet political pressure from Churchill and Roosevelt overruled the admirals. They even overruled the grim assessment of First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Dudley Pound. Pound had described the convoys as a millstone around our necks. The convoys would continue. This political imperative and the exaggerated fear of the German surface fleet led directly to the catastrophic dispersal of convoy PQ-17. The convoy carried an immense volume of war material. This included 600 tanks, 4,000 trucks and jeeps, and 150,000 tons of military cargo. It was initially well escorted, but Pound acted on misinterpretations and anxieties. He overrode the advice of his staff. On July 4th, he issued the fateful order for the convoy to scatter. This was done despite the home fleet being within operational distance. The order transformed a potentially manageable situation into a massacre. The dispersal rendered the merchant ships easy prey for German air attacks. He-115 torpedo bombers and FW-200 Condors descended upon the now isolated vessels. Over the next hours, waves of aircraft systematically destroyed the convoy. The tragedy underscored how strategic blunders and flawed intelligence could negate overwhelming numerical superiority. The German surface operation was foiled by its own mishaps. The Lützow grounded, and destroyers ran onto rocks. By that time, however, the damage had already been done. 22 out of 33 merchant ships were lost. This included 123,000 tons of vital military cargo. PQ-17 became a grim symbol of Allied vulnerability and strategic miscalculation. It was a stark reminder that naval warfare was not just about the size of one's guns. It was about the clarity of command in the face of unseen threats. The human cost was immediate and palpable. Sailors clung to debris in the icy water. British delegates on the doomed convoy prioritized chocolate for their families back home. This small luxury was sought after years of privation. The USS Washington transitioned rapidly to the Pacific theater. This logistical feat was necessitated by the relentless pressure of the Japanese advance. The immense battleship departed New York on August 23, 1942. It embarked on a voyage that culminated in the ticklish business of navigating the Panama Canal. Its 108-foot, 4-inch beam left mere inches of clearance within the locks. This was a terrifyingly close fit for a vessel designed to project power across oceans. Escorted by destroyers, the ship steamed through the Mona Passage. It crossed the equator, where the ancient rites of Neptune's initiation began. These rites subjected the polywogs to brutal trials. The trials involved Shilla legs and a canvas tank filled with indescribable muck. This moment of chaotic tradition offered a brief, jarring contrast to the grim reality that awaited them. The battleship arrived in a Pacific theater reeling from catastrophic losses. The fleet had been severely depleted. It suffered the sinking of the USS Wasp and heavy damage to the USS North Carolina from Japanese submarines. The prize and the graveyard was Guadalcanal. There, the fight for Henderson Field had devolved into a brutal attritional struggle. The Washington was immediately elevated to a key command role. This occurred with the arrival of Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, Jr. He was known universally as Ching Lee. Lee was an intellectual and approachable leader. He quickly established the Gun Club. This was a circle focused on advanced gunnery instruction and technique. His presence fostered a conversational circle for examining new radar and fire control techniques. This signaled that the ship would be the epicenter of the Navy's effort. Their goal was to master the dark art of night fighting. The necessity of this mastery had been brutally demonstrated months earlier. This occurred at the Battle of Savo Island. On the night of July 7 through 8, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's force had launched a surprise attack in Sealark Channel. Allied cruisers and destroyers were present. However, the Allies lacked effective night warfare training and had primitive radars. This contrasted starkly with the Japanese' superior optics and tactics. The result was a swift, devastating defeat. The American cruisers Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were destroyed. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was also destroyed. This resulted in the loss of 23 men. The channel was grimly renamed Iron Bottom Sound. It became a watery graveyard, testifying to the critical need for superior intelligence and effective coordination. The battles that followed in November 1942 were fought to reverse that tactical deficit. The first naval battle of Guadalcanal erupted in the early hours of Friday the 13th. It was a chaotic, close-quarters melee in Iron Bottom Sound. Admiral Abbey's volunteer bombardment force aimed to destroy Henderson Field. It was intercepted by Task Group 67.4. The battle instantly devolved into a breakdown of communication and command. When the destroyer Cushing spotted the enemy, ships closed on a collision course. The Japanese immediately ordered illumination. In the terrifying confusion, the U.S. lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. This included the Atlanta, whose bridge disappeared in a volley of fire. The Juno was also struck by a torpedo and exploded. The explosion killed nearly her entire crew, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. The night was a slaughter, a floating junkyard of burning hulks. Yet, despite the appalling losses and indecisive leadership, the American forces succeeded in their primary objective. They prevented the Japanese from bombarding Henderson Field. They also forced their transports to turn back. This set the stage for the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It occurred on the night of November 14 through 15. Admiral Halsey was desperate for ships. He ordered Task Force 64 to intercept Admiral Kondo's force. Task Force 64 comprised the Washington, the newly installed South Dakota, and a screen of 4 destroyers. Kondo's force was determined to put Henderson Field out of commission. The American destroyers, steaming ahead, found themselves in grave peril. They began taking hits as all hell broke loose. Then, the South Dakota suffered a self-inflicted disaster. A critical electrical power surge disabled her guns and communications. This was a consequence of damage and an engineering misjudgment. Illuminated by Japanese searchlights, the massive battleship became a stark silhouette. It stood out against the burning debris of the destroyers. It absorbed 42 enemy hits that demolished her radar plot and superstructure. Crucially, it was drawing fire and masking the presence of the Washington Soul. The Washington, under Captain Harvey Walsh and Admiral Ching Lee, possessed the critical technological advantage. This was the superior SG radar. While the South Dakota was being pummeled, the Washington tracked targets her sister ship could not even see. At midnight, a tense moment occurred. Captain Walsh had to receive permission from Admiral Lee to fire. Then, the Washington opened up on the largest target. That target was the Japanese battleship Kirishima, at a range of only 8,400 yards. The sound of the 9 massive, 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells leaving the barrels was a deafening, blasting white light. This light momentarily blinded the crew. The third salvo landed squarely amidships, devastating the Kirishima. The overwhelming firepower of the American battleship's main battery, firing in rapid and powerful bursts, knocked out 3 of the Japanese battleship's 4 turrets. It also rendered her steering gear useless. The Kirishima was transformed into a towering mass of flame. Her hull glowed cherry red in the darkness before she sank by 0030. Following this decisive duel, the Washington evaded multiple Japanese torpedo attacks. This action demonstrated the skill of its crew. Admiral Lee then ordered the ship to reverse course. This maneuver drew the remaining Japanese forces away from any damaged American ships still struggling in the darkness. This victory was profound. Coupled with the subsequent destruction of Admiral Tanaka's transports, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal marked the definitive end of Japan's offensive naval capabilities in the South Pacific. Despite Japanese propaganda claiming a great naval victory, the reality was a strategic defeat. The sheer effectiveness of American battleship gunnery, combined with the technological edge of radar, had secured the crucial strategic objective. Guadalcanal was safe. It marked the fork in the road which leads to victory for the United States. The strategic pivot of the Pacific War was endorsed by the Anglo-American Combined Chiefs of Staff in May of 1943. This shift moved the U.S. Navy decisively from defensive actions to a massive island-hopping offensive. This Central Pacific advance was championed by Admirals King and Nimitz. It leveraged the mobility of the new fast carrier task forces. However, it demanded that the battleships be ruthlessly modernized to survive the coming storm. The USS Washington, already a veteran of the Atlantic, was constantly adapting its formidable structure. A major upgrade addressed the critical limitation of earlier anti-aircraft weaponry. The original 1.1-inch guns, milled to such fine tolerances, jammed whenever their barrels heated up. They were swiftly replaced by the devastating 40mm Bofors guns. The battleship was soon bristling with 60 new Bofors. Each Bofors shell possessed a bursting charge, lethal even without a direct hit. This significantly improved the ship's defensive shield. The true revolution, however, occurred within the ship's armored heart. Gunnery Officer Ed Hooper, known as Hoopa, spearheaded an innovative effort. This effort was often unofficial. It aimed to integrate radar more deeply into fire control. Working with Chief Engineer Commander John Red Strother, Hooper designed and installed a servo-mechanical repeating system. This system fed radar data directly into the main battery plotting room. It effectively created the fleet's first afloat Combat Information Center, or CIC. This innovation transformed situational awareness. It allowed the Washington to process and respond to threats with unprecedented speed. This was despite the constant battle against rust and corrosion that earned the battleship the weary nickname Rusty W. This technological and tactical evolution was immediately put to the test against Japanese strongholds. The strategic need to neutralize enemy staging areas led to the bombardment of Nauru Island. On December 8, 1943, the second anniversary of the Pacific War, the Washington steamed toward the atoll. At 0700, Admiral Lee gave the order to open fire. The 16-inch guns unleashed their full, terrifying power. The battleship expended 135 high-capacity shells. This transformed Nauru into a smoking inferno. Piers, sheds, and freighters erupted in flames. The bombardment was so intense that Ed Hooper became concerned for the 6,000 Micronesians on the island. He attempted, largely in vain, to ensure shells landed only on military targets. Amidst the continuous roar of the main battery, the crew experienced a moment of intense elation. This occurred when the starboard 5-inch battery tracked and destroyed an incoming Betty bomber. This was the ship's first confirmed kill. It sent the crew into a frenzy of celebration audible across the forecastle. The ultimate objective of this relentless advance was the Marianas. This was known as Operation Forager. It was a necessary step to establish forward bases for the B-29 bombers that would strike the Japanese home islands. The Japanese, under Admiral Toyota, countered with Operation Ago. This was a complex plan to lure and destroy the U.S. fleet. Admiral Spruance deployed a colossal force, Task Force 58. The battleships, including the Washington, formed a critical defensive shield around the vulnerable carriers. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea commenced. This confrontation would decide the fate of Japanese naval aviation. The Japanese launched wave after wave of aircraft in a desperate bid to strike the carriers. Many planes flew dangerously low, some as low as 150 feet over the water. They were met by overwhelming American air superiority. The battle quickly earned its grim moniker, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The air was filled with chaos, but the U.S. defense was systematic and devastating. Guchko, aboard the Washington, watched the AA gunners. These were kids, a tremendous group. They unleashed a torrent of fire, knocking down enemy planes with such mechanical effectiveness that he likened the spectacle to Coney Island. Rollo Ross saw enemy aircraft coming in from all directions. These planes were quickly shredded by the continuous, overwhelming curtain of flak. The American Hellcat fighters shredded the initial Japanese air formations. They systematically reduced the enemy's air strength from 430 to a mere 100 planes. This virtually obliterated Japan's trained aviator corps. The sinking of the carriers Taiho and Shokaku by U.S. submarines sealed the fate of the Japanese mobile fleet. This effectively ended its capacity for carrier warfare. Yet, even amidst this overwhelming technological and tactical dominance, the greatest threat often arose from the very complexity and scale of the American operation. On February 1, 1944, following the intense bombardment of Kwajalein, the fleet was navigating in the inky pre-dawn blackness. The equatorial night hung around the ships like a shroud. At 0428, disaster struck. The immense USS Washington and the USS Indiana collided in a deafening, catastrophic accident. It was a 90,000-ton fender bender. The limitations of early radar contributed to the catastrophe. It showed close proximity contacts only as indistinct grass on the scope. The Indiana's bow tore into the Washington's port side. This collapsed the main deck and ripped open the galley. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Debris, oil, and bodies slicked the sea. Bart Studley was cast into the oil-caked water. He endured a terrifying struggle for survival. He later recalled the desperate, disorienting moment when he was convinced he was losing his mind. He was then rescued and learned his cabin mate had been obliterated in the impact. The violence of the accident, wholly unrelated to enemy action, resulted in fatal injuries. This included a crewman struck and killed by a propeller. The Washington, severely damaged, made speed for Majuro Atoll. There, a subsequent board of inquiry would attempt to untangle the self-inflicted carnage. The collision served as a brutal, visceral reminder. Despite the battleship's overwhelming power and the strategic successes against the enemy, the fragility of these immense machines was paramount. The critical role of human vigilance was also paramount in the vast, unforgiving Pacific theater. The colossal scale of the Pacific War reached its zenith in October of 1944. The invasion of Leyte precipitated the largest naval engagement in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The U.S. High Command was emboldened by the crippled state of Japanese air power and the success of preliminary raids. They had accelerated the invasion plan, bypassing Yap and Palau to strike directly at Leyte. This aggressive strategic gamble was championed by Admiral Halsey and General MacArthur. It set the stage for a sprawling, complex battle. This engagement nearly resulted in catastrophic failure due to command and communication breakdowns. The Japanese, operating under Admiral Toyoda, were desperate. Their Show 1 Operation Alert relied on a sophisticated, multi-pronged counterattack. This plan was designed to sacrifice the last of their carrier air power to achieve a strategic victory. Admiral Ozawa's northern force, comprising 4 carriers, was designated as a sacrificial decoy. This force was intended to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north. Once Halsey was committed, Admiral Kurita's center force would pass through the undefended San Bernardino Strait. This center force comprised the heaviest battleships and cruisers. It would then fall upon the vulnerable Leyte landing forces. Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, was keenly focused on the destruction of the enemy fleet. He interpreted this mission as paramount. When Ozawa's decoy was sighted, Halsey took the bait despite advice suggesting a more cautious approach. He steamed north with the majority of his forces. He made the critical decision to leave the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. This decision was compounded by vague communication. Halsey's messages failed to explicitly state that Task Force 34, which included the Washington and other fast battleships, had been pulled north. This led Admiral Kincaid of the 7th Fleet to mistakenly believe the strait was securely covered by the formidable battle line. The consequences of this miscalculation became terrifyingly apparent on the morning of October 25th. The 7th Fleet was achieving a textbook victory against Nishimura's southern force in the Battle of Surigao Strait. This was the last classic battleship engagement of the war. Meanwhile, Kurita's center force, still potent despite earlier air attacks, had slipped through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait undetected. This exposed the escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts of Taffy III. This small force, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, was now vulnerable to the full, overwhelming might of Kurita's battleships and heavy cruisers. It was a mismatch of unparalleled proportions. The small American force faced enemy fire from ships that possessed about 100 broadsides per ship. This was compared to their own older battleships remaining 13 full broadsides, as Kincaid urgently reported. They fought with desperate courage. They launched torpedoes, made smoke, and used every weapon at their disposal. They even used the guns of the escort carriers in a near-suicidal defense. The drama of the situation finally broke through the command fog. Kincaid's desperate pleas for help and Admiral Nimitz's coded message from Washington reached Halsey. The message read, "Where is RPT? Where is task? For 34 RR the world wonders." The second message was interpreted as a public humiliation. It reportedly caused the aggressive admiral to break down. Only then, after the light carrier Chitos and the fleet carrier Zuikaku, the last of the Pearl Harbor veterans, had been sunk, did Halsey finally order Task Force 34 South. But it was too late. Kurita, having inexplicably broken off his pursuit of Taffy III, was already in retreat. The delayed arrival of the fast battleships off the strait did nothing to mitigate the near disaster. The Battle of Leyte Gulf concluded with the Japanese Navy shattered. Yet, the near loss of the landing force exposed the perilous vulnerability of the fleet to natural forces as well as command failures. Just weeks later, in December of 1944, Task Force 38, under Halsey, sailed directly into a devastating typhoon. The weather forecasting was primitive. This was a critical vulnerability that the sea exploited mercilessly. The storm was a terrifying, disorienting force. The sea was streaked white with mountainous, broad, frequent swells. This caused ships to roll over to extreme angles and stay there. They were suspended in a moment of terrifying uncertainty. Cooking became impossible, and sleep was elusive. Waves caused lacerations. Even simple tasks were difficult due to the ship's extreme rolling. The typhoon resulted in the loss of 3 destroyers, the Hull, Monaghan, and Spence. 709 men were lost. The storm caused significant damage to 7 other vessels and 186 aircraft. The devastating impact of the weather exposed the fleet's fragility. This prompted a critical reassessment of operational planning by Admiral Nimitz. As the war entered 1945, the final brutal campaigns for Iwo Jima and Okinawa introduced a new, terrifying dimension to naval warfare. This was the kamikaze. These suicidal aerial assaults fundamentally altered the risk calculus for every sailor. The battle for Iwo Jima was characterized by unrelenting naval bombardment against Japanese defenses. These defenses were so deeply entrenched in tunnel networks and blockhouses that even the immense scale of ordnance expended proved insufficient. On D-Day, February 19th, the USS Washington expended 599 16-inch shells and 828 5-inch shells. This contributed to an overall total of 300,000 shells and 14,000 tons of explosives. Yet, the assault force suffered more losses than the defenders. This was a testament to the ineffectiveness of even massive bombardment against hidden positions. The kamikaze threat intensified exponentially at Okinawa. The terror was palpable. The attacks came from everywhere, inducing premonitions of doom. The Japanese, recognizing the futility of traditional air attacks, turned their pilots into living bombs. The sight of these planes, intent on self-destruction, fundamentally changed the nature of defense. From the forecastle of the Washington, the crew witnessed the terrifying spectacle of the suicidal aerial assaults. Task Force 58 endured multiple kamikaze attacks. They sank the escort carrier Bismarck C, which was a frail little Kaiser coffin. They severely damaged the Franklin and Bunker Hill. The sheer volume of these attacks strained the fleet to its breaking point. Naval vessels were required to operate at dangerously close ranges to shore defenses. This necessitated precise station-keeping in shallow shoal water. General quarters were often maintained without a break for extended periods. This turned the decks of the battleships into unforgiving, sleepless environments. The final desperate Japanese offensive was Operation Tengo. It saw the colossal battleship Yamato, a giant 62,000-ton floating kamikaze, sunk by air attacks. This marked the definitive end of Japan's offensive naval capabilities. The relentless, suicidal nature of the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa served as a grim, visceral prelude to the war's end. It influenced the strategic considerations that ultimately led to the decision to use the atomic bomb. The relentless, attritional warfare that defined the final push across the Pacific demanded the utmost from the U.S. Navy. The USS Washington remained at the spearhead until the very end. The battleship had weathered collisions, typhoons, and the brutal close-quarters duels of Iron Bottom Sound. It was a hardened veteran. Its massive guns were a constant presence in the final, desperate campaigns. During the Okinawa operation, the Washington was claimed to be the sole vessel to remain on station for 67 continuous days. This was a true testament to the endurance of both the ship and its crew. This grueling period demanded staggering logistical support. In its last 2 weeks of combat alone, the ship burned over 4.8 million gallons of fuel. It also refueled 15 times. Furthermore, the Washington dispensed nearly 3 million gallons of oil to its escorting destroyers. The constant threat of kamikaze attacks meant general quarters was the rule, not the exception. A significant morale boost did arrive, however, on May 16th. The supply ship Aldebaran delivered much-needed fresh provisions after a long period of scarcity. Captain Roscoe Good fondly recalled that crucial moment. The final act of the war came swiftly. On May 27th, Admiral Lee was ordered home. He was the intellectual architect of the Washington's night-fighting success. Lee was tasked with organizing an anti-kamikaze research unit. This order was a tacit admission that the suicidal aerial attacks had become the dominant threat. The very next day, Admiral Halsey shifted his flag to the Missouri. Halsey redesignated the fleet as the Third Fleet and relieved Admiral Spruance. This familiar shift in command marked the constant operational rotation of the Pacific War. The ship's combat role concluded with its return to Leyte on June 1st. It threaded the Surigao Strait, the site of the war's last classic battleship engagement. With the cessation of combat operations, the Washington began its long journey home. After a brief escort into Pearl Harbor on June 15th, the ship proceeded onward. It arrived at the Puget Sound Navy Yard on June 24th for a necessary overhaul. While the battleship lay in dry dock, the world was irrevocably changed. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima occurred 12 days after the caisson was sealed. This was followed by Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd. These events brought the war to a definitive, if terrifying, conclusion. The shift from intense combat to demobilization was immediate and profound. The Washington, designed and built to destroy the enemy, was suddenly converted into a troop transport. This was for Operation Magic Carpet. The mission was tasked with bringing thousands of victorious but weary servicemen home. This transition fundamentally altered the ship's operational role and environment. The hardened wartime crew was accustomed to the brutal discipline of Captain Good. They were also used to the constant, lethal threat of attack. Now they witnessed the arrival of new, less experienced personnel. They also had to contend with the often boisterous behavior of returning soldiers. The ship's final active-duty voyage underscored its enduring capability. After embarking troops in Southampton, the Washington faced a challenging passage across the North Atlantic. Amidst heavy seas and near-freezing temperatures, the crew was called upon for one final dramatic rescue. A helmsman's skill and the collective effort of the crew were required to save a man named Oakes from the frigid water. This was a final testament to the ship's ingrained resilience. It proved their capability even as the Washington's operational life drew to a close. The Washington finally reached New York, mooring at Pier 88. The date was October 3, 1946. Its journey was not quite over yet. It served briefly as a training vessel, carrying midshipmen on cruises. This was a final, sedate chapter for a ship that had known such violence. On October 1, 1946, the battleship cast off its buoy for the very last time. It was heading for Bayonne, New Jersey, the site of its decommissioning. On June 27, 1947, the USS Washington was formally placed out of commission. For men like Hunter Cronin, who had come of age within its steel hull, leaving the ship was deeply emotional. It felt like parting with a sick old friend. The final indignity came years later. The veteran warship was struck from the Navy Register on June 1, 1960. It was sold for scrap on May 24, 1961. Its journey to the scrapyard was observed with visceral sorrow by its former crew. They spoke of the fungus of the goddamn yardbirds cutting into her. This evoked a sense of the magnificent ship bleeding away. The trajectory of the USS Washington was clear. It moved from a vital technological marvel to a gutted, silent hulk. This served as a poignant symbol of the war's conclusion. It highlighted the rapid shift in naval power and the emotional complexity of demobilization. The scrapping marked the definitive end of an era for the fast battleships of the United States Navy. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.